We're doing a study on the book of Acts, and we're calling it Winning Our World. Winning Our World. This particular lesson, I want to focus on what I'm going to call the tale of two cities. The tale of two cities. I debated over whether I should call it the tale of two churches, but there was a famous book that was written a few years ago, The Tale of Two Cities, and so I decided to go with that. Plus, in the book of Acts, in the New Testament, you find that the way they looked at the church was the church at Ephesus, the church at Laodicea, the church at Jerusalem. And so they considered, even though there were different meeting places for these churches, they were all a part of the same church in that city. So I'm going to call it the tale of two cities. And I want to begin in Acts, the first chapter, in verse 8, where Jesus said, "But you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit is come upon you, and you shall be witnesses to me in Jerusalem, and in all Judea and Samaria, and to the end of the earth." Those are our marching orders. That's the command that Jesus Christ gives to us. Now, I want to point out, Jerusalem was the starting point for the apostles because that's their hometown. That's where they lived. And in all evangelism, evangelism begins at home. It shouldn't end there, but that's where it begins, where you live. So for these disciples, these apostles, Jerusalem was their beginning point. Now, something I notice in connection with these two cities of Jerusalem, Jerusalem always had what we would call an inward focus. An inward focus. Now, by an inward focus, that means they were not putting the emphasis outside Jerusalem, they're putting it inside Jerusalem. And because of that, they never became a missionary church. The church at Antioch, though, that we're going to contrast Jerusalem with Antioch, Antioch had an outward focus, not an inward focus, but an outward focus. They are reaching out. And they became the first church to send out missionary teams. They became a missions-focused church, a missions-driven church. And because of that, there is striking contrast between the two cities. Now, my challenge to you is simply, what do you see? Do you have an outward focus? Are you reaching out to others? Or is it inward, only thinking of yourself? I see too many churches that do this. And churches that have an inward focus always begins a death cycle. A death cycle. And I've seen it over and over again in my years of ministry. And so I challenge you, develop an outward focus, be able to see what Christ commanded us to see, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Now, I want to take 5 different areas and contrast Jerusalem with Antioch, and I think you will see a clear picture here. I'm not condemning the church at Jerusalem, but we must face the facts. We must deal with reality. What the Bible describes to us, Jerusalem is what I would describe as clannish. I would say Antioch, on the other hand, is cosmopolitan. In other words, in Jerusalem, there is this Jewish distinctive. That it's a Jewish church. They are believers in Jesus Christ, but they're all Jews. Antioch is multiracial. There's a diversity of races in Antioch. A third thing that I see concerning this culture is they were monocultural at Jerusalem. It's just Jews only. In fact, there's a scripture where it says when they sent out people preaching, it said they went and preached to the Jews only. Antioch was not that way. It was multicultural. There's all these different types of people that are there, not just different races, but you've got rich people, you've got poor people, you've got educated, uneducated. So it's a multicultural church. And then finally, I see the church at Jerusalem is what I would say, they have a vision, but it's only for Israel. That's what they're focused upon. Antioch is a contrast to that. Because at Antioch, they've got a vision for the nations, for the world. And they're wanting to reach out to others outside their city, outside their homeland. They're wanting to take it to the ends of the earth. Now, what this tells me is, as a church, we must become inclusive, not exclusive. Oh, I've seen too many churches that way. Too many churches, if you're not born in that church or you don't marry a certain person of a certain family in that church, you're always considered an outsider. That is a terrible mistake. And that's the first mistake that I see they made at the church in Jerusalem. It's one of the reasons why so many churches stopped growing. We can't find anyone else like us. If we're going to continue to grow, we're going to have to accept people that are not like us. We've got to become inclusive, not exclusive. Now, the second thing that I want to talk about, contrasting these two churches, is emphasis. The emphasis of the two churches, of Jerusalem and of Antioch. For instance, in Jerusalem, the emphasis is upon miracles. Miracles. Now, I'm not saying that miracles are bad. I'm not saying that at all. God is a God of miracles. God delights to work miracles for us. But when you make that your emphasis, you begin seeking after miracles, it becomes a problem. For Antioch, the emphasis was not on miracles, it was on ministry. Ministering to hurting people, reaching out to those that are outside the church. Now notice what happens. Because signs and wonders and miracles, that was the emphasis of the church at Jerusalem, they soon went into a death cycle. So by the end of the book of Acts, the church of Jerusalem is going out of existence. Whereas in Antioch, because their emphasis was on ministry, on helping others, miracles took place, but they took place as they ministered to the people. There's a big difference in seeking after miracles and the miracles happening as you are doing the work of the ministry. And so there's a big difference on the emphasis of these two churches. Now, my point is, if you're going to have a church that's alive and growing, it takes more than miracles to make a church grow. Oh yes, miracles will attract a crowd, but there's a big difference in a crowd and a family. A big difference between those that come to see the show, so to speak. They come to see the miracles, and those that have found their place, their relationships in a spiritual family. Now, let me talk about a third area here. The third area I want to discuss is what I'm going to call resources. Resources. Money always matters. There's always a certain amount of resources, and we have to work within those resources that God has given to us. Let me contrast these two churches. In Jerusalem, it's what I'm going to call a grasping attitude that they developed. In fact, the first sin in the church in Jerusalem was over money. A husband and wife that said they had sold a piece of property and they wanted to give the money to the church. The truth is, they were giving a part of the money, pretending like they were giving it all. A grasping attitude, holding on to it. The church at Antioch? No. It was a generous attitude. A generous attitude. In Acts, the 13th chapter, it talks about how that they sent out the first missionary team of Barnabas and Paul. And it said, they sent them away. The wording there tells us they didn't just say, goodbye, we'll be praying for you. No, they gave them money. They underwrote the expenses of this first missionary party in sending them out from the church at Antioch. It's a generous attitude of reaching out rather than trying to hold on to what you have. Now, what does this accomplish? At the church in Jerusalem, there was a decreased giving. Giving began to get smaller, whereas in Antioch, it was increased giving. They became more and more generous in their giving as the church continued to grow. So by the time you come to the end of the story of the church at Jerusalem, this is the way the Bible describes it. Quote, "The poor saints at Jerusalem," end quote. Oh, what tragic words. Tragic words. The poor saints at Jerusalem. Why? It all went back to the attitude toward money, the attitude toward resources. Whereas the church at Antioch, it continued to grow. It continued to have increased giving, and they are planting new churches that are now helping them fulfill the Great Commission. What a vision. What a tremendous contrast between these two churches. I would say my conclusion on this is simply basically, money follows ministry. It always does. The vision that you have, and because the church at Antioch had this vision of taking the good news of Jesus Christ to the end of the earth, money followed that. The resources were made available for them. What a contrast between the two churches. Now let me talk about a fourth area. The fourth area I want to talk about is purpose. Purpose. What is the purpose behind our Christian walk, our Christian journey? What is the purpose? What are we trying to accomplish? When you look at the church at Jerusalem, and oh my, this is sad. It comes from the 6th chapter of the book of Acts. It said, there arose a murmuring among the believers at the church at Jerusalem. They become the murmuring saints. Oh my, I don't want to get personal here, but we've all seen it, haven't we? We've all seen churches that were full of complainers. They complain about all kinds of things. It's either too hot or it's too cold. The music's too loud or I can't hear it. The sermon's too long or it's too short. Murmuring saints. What a tragedy. The church at Antioch, on the other hand, instead of murmuring, they became what was known as a missionary church. The church with a missionary vision. They're reaching out to the nations around them. There's a lot of excitement and enthusiasm in the church at Antioch because their emphasis not on themselves, it's on reaching out to others. And so they become known as the missionary church. At the church at Jerusalem, pastoral care became the primary ministry. Pastoral care. In fact, that's what they were complaining about. They were complaining in Acts, the 6th chapter, because some of the widows had been inadvertently overlooked when they were distributing their daily food. They obviously had some kind of a system to feed the poor saints. And so as they're reaching out to them, somebody got overlooked. And so there's a lot of complaining going on. Where's the emphasis? It goes back to pastoral care. Now, this is what I see happens to a lot of churches. It's my church, our church. We got to take care of ourselves before we help anybody else. The church of Antioch was not that way. The church of Antioch had a focus that was external, that was reaching outward. Teaching became the primary ministry. That's what they became known by. There were certain prophets and teachers at the church at Antioch. That was the primary ministry. We're teaching, we're discipling, we're training, we are equipping believers for the work of the ministry. Oh, that's healthy. That is healthy. What a contrast between these two churches. Now, my point is simply this. Little things become big problems when we lack purpose. You find the church at Jerusalem being consumed with this grumbling and complaining attitude because somebody didn't get their meal today. Somebody was overlooked when they distributed the bread. Oh, it's a shame when a church can fight over a piece of bread, when they can quarrel over the least little things, the color of the carpet, that they complain about what color of paint we're going to use. The problem is, you've forgotten your purpose. Your purpose is not here to please grandma or the grandchildren. No, the purpose is to obey the command of Jesus Christ. Take the good news. You don't have to die, you can live. Take that good news to the end of the earth. The church at Jerusalem failed terribly, and these are the reasons behind it, why they failed so miserably. Now let me talk about a fifth area here. The fifth area I want to discuss is the area of authority. Authority. And I see a striking difference between the two churches. For instance, the church at Jerusalem has an attitude of superiority. The church at Antioch, rather, had an attitude of submission. Now, I'm not picking on anyone because I understand that names many times really do not truly represent a church. But how many churches have this attitude? We are the first church, or we are the main church. We are the biggest church. And they develop an attitude of superiority. We've got more money. We've got better education. It's not what you have. It's what are you doing with what you have that makes the difference. The church at Jerusalem, this attitude of superiority, and here's where it comes from. They've got the 12 apostles. And of course, 11 of those were chosen by Jesus. Only Judas had failed, and they quickly filled his spot with someone else. And so they've got the 12 apostles in Jerusalem. You don't find that in Antioch. You find the church at Antioch in Acts the 13th chapter. They said there were certain prophets and teachers in the church at Antioch. They didn't have any of the original apostles at Antioch. No. They got prophets and teachers. It's an attitude of submission to authority. And so when there arose a conflict, this is what the church at Antioch did. They go to Jerusalem to consult with those 12 apostles to see what they ought to do about this problem. But they've got a good attitude toward authority. Now, I'm going to say the church at Jerusalem had what I'm going to call an authoritarian government. The 12 apostles. They take this attitude of superiority. We are going to make the decision. We know what's right and wrong. The church at Antioch developed what I would call a corporate style of government. In other words, they had many people from different walks of life, different cultures that came together to establish the leadership of their church. It's a corporate mentality of all of us are smarter than any one of us. Now, of course, they had leadership. We see that very clearly, that there's strong leadership there, but it's a different attitude toward authority. And that's the emphasis here. See, authority should be developed to promote security for more growth. So it should provide the security, a safe place where ministry can take place, a safe place where we can plant new churches rather than hindering it or trying to control it. Now, this is the basic difference I see in the church world today, that so many churches take the attitude of control rather than of blessing and trying to minister to others. God help us to be more like the church at Antioch. The church at Antioch was the first church in the book of Acts that focused on the Great Commission. The church at Jerusalem never did that. They never became a missionary church, and within a few years, they went into extinction. They actually closed the doors. There were no more believers for the church in Jerusalem. Antioch, though, because they're trying to fulfill the Great Commission, they're reaching out to the nations, God begins to multiply apostolic ministry. Now, I know that there are people today that struggle with that. They struggle with even the terminology of apostles. But listen to what it says in Acts, the 14th chapter and verse 14. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard this. Now notice what's happened here. Barnabas and Paul are now called apostles. Apostles. They're not a part of the original 12. They never claimed that. They never tried to take an attitude of superiority. The point is, when the church at Antioch began to reach out with evangelistic ministry, began to fulfill the Great Commission, God blessed it. And He blessed it to the extent that He wasn't just raising up new churches. He wasn't just doing mighty signs and miracles that took place. No. New apostles rose up through the ranks. Barnabas and Paul are the first ones that are named. Actually, when you go and study the New Testament from the Greek language, you'll find that there are 22 people in the New Testament that are actually referred to as apostles in the Greek language. It's the wording he uses. So what I'm saying is, because they began doing what Jesus told them to do, because they're now reaching out and fulfilling the Great Commission, God began to bless it. New churches, wonderful signs and miracles, but new apostolic ministry that was raised up because of it. Now, the church at Jerusalem, it's the opposite. For instance, when Paul went back to Jerusalem, he had some things he wanted to do, and his heart was right. Paul sincerely loved the Jews. He sincerely loved his people. He loved Jerusalem. But when he gets to Jerusalem, what happens? He was arrested. The question is, where were all the Christians when Paul was arrested? Let me read it to you from the 21st chapter of the book of Acts. Acts, the 21st chapter, and verse 17, it says, when we had come to Jerusalem, that's Paul and his ministry party, when they got there, he said, the brethren received us gladly. He goes in, he sees James, who's the pastor of the church, sees the elders of the church, meets with the apostles. It goes on to say in verse 20, Acts 21 and 20, and when they heard it, in other words, the report that Paul and his ministry team had brought about what God was doing among the Gentiles, among the Greek-speaking people, they glorified the Lord. And then they said to him, you see, brother, how many myriads of Jews. Now, the word that is used there in the Greek language for myriads is just literally a number that's you can't count. There are tens of thousands of these people. We don't know exactly how many, but there are myriads of Jews there are who have believed. They believed what? They believed that Jesus is the Messiah. They believe Jesus is the Christ. But then notice what he says. And they are all zealous for the law. They are zealous for the law of Moses. That's what it's saying. Now, the problem is they should have been zealous about fulfilling the Great Commission. But rather than being zealous for obeying the words of Christ, remember, Jesus said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. They're not doing that. They're zealous for the law of Moses, and it creates terrible conflict for them. In fact, it's my personal belief that it took Paul's arrest and execution to bring conviction on the early church to make it a missionary church. And so many times that's what happens. It takes problems to motivate us to pray. It takes trouble to motivate us to obey God, what we should have done in the first place. And that's what's happening here, because the emphasis is all wrong. The church at Jerusalem, the Jewish believers are emphasizing circumcision. Whereas the church at Antioch, the Gentile believers are emphasizing Jesus Christ. Now, I ask you the same question. What are you doing with your faith? Which church do you identify with? Which of these two becomes where you live, the church where you are? It's not that I despise the church at Jerusalem, I don't. There was many wonderful things about the church at Jerusalem, but I'll be honest with you, friend, I want to be a member, I want to be a part of the church at Antioch. I want to be a part of a church that is reaching out to fulfill the Great Commission. I want to be a part of a church that emphasis is on Jesus Christ, not on all of our rules and our regulations. I'm not interested in your religiosity. No, I'm interested in a relationship with a living Lord, with Jesus Christ. And I believe this is why the Bible tells us, Acts, the 11th chapter and verse 26, the end of that verse, and the disciples were first called Christians at Antioch. That's what I want to be called. I want to be called a Christian, a follower of Christ. I want to represent Him and what He is doing. I pray that by contrasting these two cities, that you're able to determine where you are and what you are experiencing, what's taking place in your life. And God, help us to get out of this mentality of us four and no more. You know, we're just trying to keep a little group holy so we can go to heaven. Listen, friend, the church is not a bus stop waiting so we could go to heaven someday. Not at all. The church is a place of evangelism, of reaching out and taking the good news of Jesus Christ to the end of the earth. So in your Christian journey, I challenge you, join the believers at Antioch, and let's work together to fulfill the Great Commission.